The rain started just before the service. Not heavy, not dramatic, just steady enough to blur the stained glass windows of that small-town chapel and soften the edges of everything inside. The sky was gray, the air cool, and the organ played low, slow notes that seemed to hang in the room a second longer than they should. It felt composed, controlled, almost rehearsed. My grandmother was described the way she always had been, fair, traditional, a woman who believed in loyalty. The pastor repeated those words carefully, and people nodded in quiet agreement. They fit her. Or at least, they fit the version of her everyone preferred to remember. At the front of the chapel, my older brother stood near the casket like he had been assigned the role. Calm, steady, accepting condolences with a soft, solemn expression and a slight tilt of his head. He looked tired but dignified. The devoted grandson. The one who stayed. That was the story. He stayed. He sacrificed. He cared for her. After the viewing, the estate attorney stepped forward. His voice was measured and neutral, almost clinical. No drama. No pauses for effect. Just clean legal language delivered in an even tone. The house. 14 acres of land. The antique collection. The brokerage account. All major assets were left to my brother. Then the reason was read aloud, plain and official. He stayed. He sacrificed. He cared for her. You could feel the shift in the room. Not shock. Not outrage. Just confirmation. Like something everyone had quietly decided long before that moment. I wasn't surprised. Not exactly. But I wasn't prepared for how final it would feel. Nothing for me. Not even a small keepsake. Not a piece of jewelry. Not a written note. My name wasn't even mentioned in passing. It was as if I had stepped out of the story entirely. And then came the part that wasn't written in the will. As people moved past the casket one last time, my brother leaned slightly toward me, close enough that no one else could hear him over the soft hum of the organ. You left, he said quietly. You get what you earned. His tone wasn't angry. It wasn't emotional. It was calm, assured, like he was explaining something obvious, something simple. Around us, relatives offered polite smiles. A few gave me sympathetic looks. Most kept their expressions neutral. But there were subtle nods too. Small gestures that said without words that they agreed with him. The narrative was airtight. I had moved to the city years ago. I took a job. I built a life somewhere else. I missed holidays. I wasn't there for every Sunday dinner. He stayed in town. He visited her regularly. He ran errands. He was visible. And in a small town, visibility matters more than details. What no one mentioned, what no one seemed to consider, was that she had a daily nurse. That her medications were organized by a care service. That grocery deliveries arrived every Thursday like clockwork. Most of her real, day-to-day needs were handled by professionals. He visited 2, maybe 3 times a week. Sometimes less. But perception is louder than documentation. And perception won. By the time we stepped outside into the steady rain, it already felt finished. Inheritance settled. Case closed. The older brother rewarded. The one who left, quietly written out. If you watched it from the outside, you'd think this was a simple story. Favoritism. Tradition. The cost of independence. And that's exactly what made it convincing. Because it felt complete. When a narrative feels complete, no one looks for cracks. But something about the way my brother moved that day stayed with me. It wasn't grief. It wasn't relief. It was possession. He wasn't just mourning. He was securing. I noticed how he stayed close to the attorney after the reading. How he answered questions before they were fully asked. How quickly he began talking about next steps for the land and the house. Not later. Not next week. Immediately. As if the funeral were just a checkpoint on a longer plan. At one point, Aunt Marlene squeezed his arm and said softly, "She always knew who was loyal." He didn't correct her. He didn't hesitate. He simply accepted it. That was the performance. And it worked. If you had walked out of that chapel with everyone else, you would have believed the story. That caregiving had been rewarded. That loyalty had been measured and paid accordingly. That fairness, in its own traditional way, had been served. Even I almost believed it. And that's the part that unsettled me the most. Because when something feels clean, when it feels settled, you stop asking questions. You stop looking at the details. You stop wondering why my grandmother, who labeled leftovers with dates, who kept receipts from the 1990s, who documented everything down to the smallest transaction, would leave no private note. No quiet acknowledgement. No separate instruction. Nothing at all. Didn't feel like her. But grief makes you question your instincts. It makes you assume you must be wrong. So I drove home that night through the rain, windshield wipers moving back and forth in steady rhythm, telling myself maybe this was just how it ended. Maybe leaving town had cost more than I realized. Maybe staying visible had mattered more than staying connected. Maybe he was right. Maybe I got what I earned. And that's where the story wanted to end. A clean conclusion. The devoted brother wins. The independent sibling learns a lesson. Case finished. But 3 days later, a certified envelope arrived with my name on it. From the same estate attorney. And that's when the first crack appeared. 3 days after the funeral, a small, unassuming package arrived at my door. The kind of envelope you barely notice among bills and flyers. But this one carried weight. The return address was the estate attorney, same as the one who had read the will, but the handwriting on the front was unmistakably my grandmother's. Careful looping script with a note in red ink that immediately caught my eye. Open only if you were told there was nothing. I held it for a moment. My thumb brushed over the edges, over the words, and I felt a strange pulse of anticipation. It was deliberate, specific, calculated. Who had anticipated my reaction? How had she known I would be left feeling invisible? Like my existence didn't matter at all. She had set a trap, a test, and I was holding the key. Inside, there was a second letter, folded with the kind of precision you usually only see in old documents meant to last decades. It was dated 6 months before her death. I knew immediately this wasn't some casual posthumous note. It was intentional foresight. A private instruction, hidden from the public eye, sealed until the exact moment it might be needed. Alongside the letter was a small sheet listing a separate account number, a key to a safety deposit box taped carefully inside, and a precise value, $312,480.17. Not rounded, not symbolic, exact down to the cent. She wanted me to see the clarity of her choice. It wasn't an afterthought, it was deliberate. This is not in the will, the letter emphasized, with an almost whispered urgency that made the words feel alive on the paper. And just like that, the neat stability of the legal world crumbled. If this wasn't in the will, why hadn't anyone mentioned it? Why hadn't the attorney disclosed it? Every assumption I'd carried away from the funeral, the certainty of my brother's care, the completeness of the estate, the narrative that had everyone nodding in silent agreement, started to unravel. I drove to the bank that afternoon, the rain from the funeral still soft in my memory, and entered the familiar lobby with a mixture of skepticism and anticipation. The teller, an older man with sharp eyes and a practiced smile, led me to a small back room. There, behind a heavy steel door, the safety deposit box waited. I inserted the key, and the box clicked open like the turning of a lock, not just on metal but on memory itself. Inside were several items, each deliberately curated. A copy of the property deed, annotated in my grandmother's handwriting. A small leather-bound ledger, worn at the edges, containing meticulous notes on her finances, her daily care, her visits, and her interactions with family members. A USB drive labeled only with her initials sat in the corner, and tucked beneath it all was a handwritten timeline. Short, precise entries detailing interactions, questions asked, and refusals given. The first entry caught my eye immediately. March 14th. He asked again about transferring deed. Then a few weeks later, April 2nd, I declined. The clarity of her notes left no room for argument. Every step of the way she had observed, recorded, and controlled the narrative in ways my brother couldn't see, couldn't manipulate. It was almost cinematic, the careful choreography of perception versus reality. The narrative of devotion that everyone at the funeral had accepted so readily suddenly showed its cracks. My brother hadn't been the sole caregiver. He hadn't been the moral victor or the devoted grandson. The ledger, with its detailed entries, revealed that my grandmother had daily nurse visits, meal deliveries, medications organized and monitored, appointments tracked. He had shown up, yes, but only 2 or 3 times a week. The image of him as selfless caretaker dissolved in real time as I read, line by line, the truth laid bare in careful handwriting. And there it was, the first controlled contradiction. Official probate filings listed the estate as complete, total value $1.2 million. But here, in the shadows of ink and leather, was the undisclosed account. No addendum, no side trust, no posthumous explanation. Officially, everything had been documented and resolved, but the reality told a different story. I realized something important in that moment. My grandmother had been testing the system, the people around her, and perhaps most importantly my brother. Not because she wanted to punish him exactly, but because she wanted to see who was truly prepared to act when the expected narrative failed. Who would follow rules blindly? Who would accept the story at face value? And who would notice the small, quiet openings that could change everything? The retention lock, as I came to think of it, was the ultimate experiment. I reconstructed the last 12 months meticulously, using the ledger, the timeline, and the USB. Every visit, every question, every misstep in care, every small decision was there. Each entry made the story richer, the deception clearer, and the true generosity of my grandmother obvious. She hadn't left me out. She had hidden the path. She had created a choice. See the reality or believe the comforting lie. By the time I left the bank, the rain had stopped. The clouds parted just enough for the sun to filter weakly through, giving the asphalt a slick, reflective sheen. It felt like the world was suddenly less rigid, less predetermined. The inheritance, the funeral, the judgment, all of it, was not as it had appeared. I wasn't a passive participant. I wasn't powerless. And most importantly, the story that everyone else thought had ended? It had barely begun. And that's when I knew. This wasn't about money. Not really. It was about testing perception, evaluating patience, and rewarding vigilance. If he believed he had already won, the universe had a different plan. And that plan, my grandmother's plan, had me holding the keys, not just to a safety deposit box, but to a story that no one else could rewrite. I stared at the contents of the safety deposit box for what felt like hours, running my fingers over the edges of the ledger, the USB, the deed. Everything was deliberate, precise, intentional. My grandmother hadn't just left me money. She had left me a puzzle, a test, a narrative she alone could control. And now, for the first time, I had the pieces. The second letter from her, the one sealed months before her death, seemed almost alive in my hands. Its wording was careful, measured. If you were told there was nothing, open this. If pressure increases, follow the instructions enclosed. She had anticipated their deceit, their assumptions, their attempts to manipulate the story after her passing. She knew that my brother would stand at the funeral smug, nodding as everyone else reaffirmed the narrative that he was the devoted grandson, the one who stayed, sacrificed, and cared. But she had quietly accounted for me, the one they dismissed. She had written the instructions knowing that the world believed I had nothing. That sense of deliberate foresight hit me harder than I expected. She had trusted me not just to see, but to act, to reconstruct reality from the fragments she had left behind. I flipped open the ledger again, my eyes scanning the meticulous entries. Daily nurse visits were logged, meals organized, medications administered, appointments scheduled. Each day of the past year documented in tiny, careful handwriting. And then the entries showing my brother. Brief, intermittent visits, often interrupted or superficial. I could almost feel the contrast, the difference between perception and reality. He hadn't been the devoted caretaker. He had been present in the narrative, but absent in execution. The reality began to crystallize. My grandmother had protected the account deliberately, had restricted access even from him, the one who assumed he had a right to everything. The account wasn't hidden out of favoritism. It was hidden out of foresight and strategy. A way to ensure that the story couldn't be rewritten by anyone's assumptions. She had left me a direct path, untouched and secure. And in doing so, she had illuminated the truth of their behavior. I took a deep breath and inserted the USB into my laptop. The files were there. Scanned bank statements, spreadsheets detailing deposits, withdrawals, and transfers, all pointing to a single conclusion. The exact amount she had written in her letter, $312 for 80.17, was accounted for, every cent traceable, untouchable, and outside the reach of probate. Transfer on death designation. Direct beneficiary me. Outside the legal oversight, untouchable. And the more I dug, the more the patterns emerged. My brother's attempts to access the funds had been logged, recorded, blocked by her directives. He had the power of attorney for a brief period, yes, but even then the account had been sealed. She had anticipated his moves, anticipated his sense of entitlement, and had built safeguards around them. Every detail in the ledger, every note on the timeline, every instruction on the USB was a testament to her understanding of human nature. The controlled contradictions became clear. Probate filings showed a total estate value of $1.2 million, as if everything had been declared and resolved. But the hidden account existed precisely outside those filings. No lawyer had mentioned it. No trustee had disclosed it. No family member suspected it. Officially, the story was neat, orderly, complete. But the reality was far more complicated and far more just. I felt a strange mix of emotions. Relief, empowerment, and a quiet sense of vindication. It wasn't about the money. It was about understanding the truth, seeing the manipulation for what it was, and recognizing that I had been accounted for in a way that no one else could challenge. This wasn't a story of favoritism or oversight. It was a story of foresight, trust, and careful orchestration. The letter's instructions made sense now. If pressure increases, follow the instructions enclosed. The pressure they would apply, the assumption that I had nothing, the whispered comments, the subtle manipulations at the funeral, was anticipated. She had designed a system that required me to pay attention, to recognize patterns, to reconstruct events with care. Every line of her timeline, every note about his questions and my interactions, was a breadcrumb trail leading me to clarity. I left the bank that day with the ledger, the deed, the USB tucked carefully under my arm. The rain had stopped, leaving the streets glistening reflective. I walked slowly, thinking through every detail, every implication. The public narrative had portrayed my brother as the sole heir, the devoted grandson, the one who had stayed and cared. But the reality, hidden beneath her foresight, told a completely different story. He had been positioned to think he controlled the outcome, but in truth the real control had always been hers, and now it was mine. For the first time in years, I felt a sense of agency that wasn't dictated by family expectations or public perception. The funeral, the whispered judgments, the nods of approval, those were all irrelevant. The inheritance, the true measure of value, had nothing to do with money. It was about insight, strategy, and understanding. My grandmother had left me not just assets but awareness. She had provided me with the tools to navigate the family's assumptions, to protect myself, and to recognize the difference between appearances and truth. As I sat in my car that evening reviewing the timeline one last time, I realized the elegance of her plan. She had created a controlled environment in which I could see, analyze, and act. She had left no ambiguity for me, no room for misinterpretation. And in doing so, she had demonstrated a subtle, powerful form of trust, a belief that I would not only uncover the hidden path, but also understand its significance. And so the story shifted. The public narrative of favoritism, of invisibility, of being overlooked no longer held power. The inheritance had been hidden, yes, but it was never meant as a secret reward. It was meant as revelation. My grandmother had designed the ultimate test, to see what I would do when I believed I had nothing, to see how I would respond when the world confirmed my invisibility. And now, having found her instructions, I understood exactly what she intended. The next steps were mine to choose. Not because I deserved the money more than anyone else, but because I had demonstrated awareness, diligence, and the ability to follow the story she had so carefully constructed. It wasn't about winning. It was about seeing clearly. And for the first time in that small, quiet chapel where the world had assumed the story was closed, I understood exactly who had been in control all along. I sat at the edge of the chapel pew, the second letter from my grandmother resting on my lap like a fragile promise. Outside, rain tapped softly against the stained glass windows, painting the walls in muted colors that shifted with each drop. The funeral had ended hours ago, but the residue of their judgments lingered. My brother, smug and self-assured, had strutted through the room like he owned not just the assets but the story itself. He hadn't noticed the letters. He hadn't noticed the envelope tucked into my coat, waiting for the moment when silence alone could be weaponized. Everyone else believed the narrative. The devoted grandson, the sacrifice, the loyalty. He had delivered his little speech to the family, leaning over to whisper with an air of triumph, "You left. You get what you earned." And the room nodded subtly, a collective affirmation of the injustice I had endured. That was intentional. He was performing exactly as he thought he should. But now, with the second letter open and the instructions clear, everything changed. It wasn't just about inheritance anymore. It was about truth, precision, and visibility. My grandmother hadn't merely left me money. She had created a structured revelation. And the way she had written it, anticipating their manipulation and the assumptions of favoritism, was brilliant. She had given me the ability to reconstruct events, to expose the disparity between perception and reality, and to act on it without confrontation. I ran my hands over the property deed, the annotations delicate but deliberate. My grandmother had outlined every interaction, every question my brother had asked in the last 12 months, every attempt he had made to claim control over her decisions. The ledger, the USB, the timeline, all of it was a map. It was her way of showing me where I had been undervalued, overlooked, and intentionally deprioritized, and more importantly, how to respond. I could see now that the story everyone was so ready to believe was false. My brother had been positioned to appear as the devoted caregiver, the one who sacrificed, the one who deserved it all. And yes, he had followed the motions. But the ledger revealed the truth. Visits were sporadic, superficial. Contributions were minimal compared to the time and attention my grandmother had logged for herself, and quietly for me. She had recorded everything, almost like an audit, making the difference undeniable. Her second letter had been deliberate in its wording. If pressure increases, follow the instructions enclosed. Pressure. Her awareness that my brother and others would attempt to gaslight me, to force me into accepting their narrative, was anticipated. She had foreseen their questions, their assumptions, their dismissals, and had embedded within this letter a method for navigating it all. She had created a controlled environment in which I could act, respond, and ultimately understand the true nature of their intentions. As I pieced the puzzle together, a sense of calm control washed over me. It wasn't about vindication or vengeance. It was about clarity and recognition. The public narrative, the whispered judgments, the funeral smiles, the nods of approval, held no power over me. The second letter, the account, and the ledger were all outside their reach, outside the probate process, untouchable. My grandmother had ensured that. I flipped through the ledger again, noting the precision of every entry. March 14th, the day he asked about the deed. April 2nd, her refusal, carefully logged. Every inquiry he had made to the bank, every attempt at influence, noted and blocked. She had maintained control over the assets without their awareness, ensuring the narrative could be disrupted only by someone who was observant, careful, and capable. Someone like me. There was a strange satisfaction in the realization. I had been underestimated my entire life, not because I lacked capability, but because they assumed I lacked awareness. My grandmother had understood that fully. She had built safeguards, coded instructions, and left me a trail to follow. And now, with the account, the deed, and the timeline in hand, I had the means to reconstruct the past year in a way that exposed the truth without shouting it from the rooftops. The quiet victory was intoxicating. I didn't have to argue. I didn't have to prove myself in the moment. The letter had done that work for me, silently, invisibly. My grandmother had trusted me to interpret it, to see the strategy, and to act. And I did, carefully, deliberately, without making it about humiliation or revenge. The power lay in comprehension and control, not in confrontation. For the first time, the story that had haunted me, the story of favoritism, invisibility, and being sidelined, was not just challenged. It was corrected. My grandmother's foresight had made it impossible for anyone else to claim the narrative. The second letter, the ledger, and the precise account were more than financial tools. They were instruments of truth, a framework for understanding the dynamics that had kept me marginalized. And as I left the bank with the materials carefully secured, the rain had stopped, leaving the streets shining and reflective. I walked slowly, digesting each revelation, each implication, each strategic move my grandmother had embedded. She had anticipated everything, my brother's assumptions, his smug confidence, the family's nodding approval, and built a system in which only clarity and patience could succeed. That evening I sat in my car, reviewing the entries once more. I realized the elegance of the plan. The narrative of favoritism, of invisibility, of being overlooked no longer held any weight. The inheritance, the true measure of value, had been a test all along. Not of wealth but of observation, strategy, and patience. My grandmother had designed the ultimate test, to see how I would respond when I believed I had nothing, when the world confirmed my invisibility. And now, having found her instructions, her ledger, and her second letter, I understood everything. The next steps were mine to choose. Not because I deserved the money more than anyone else, but because I had demonstrated awareness, diligence, and the ability to see what no one else did. It wasn't about winning. It was about seeing clearly and acting wisely. And for the first time in that small, quiet chapel where everyone thought the story had ended, I realized exactly who had been in control all along. The morning after I opened the second letter, I sat at the kitchen table with a quiet cup of coffee. The rain finally stopped outside. The world had resumed its rhythm, but I was acutely aware that nothing had actually returned to normal. Everything had changed. The funeral had concluded, the public narrative had been rehearsed and accepted, but in reality, the stage had shifted beneath everyone's feet. I had the tools to reconstruct truth, and with that clarity came a new kind of power, the ability to decide what to reveal, what to act on, and what to let unfold quietly. I began with the ledger, tracing each entry, each timestamp, each bank notation. It was more than a record of money, it was a testament to intent. Each note my grandmother had written revealed her foresight, her understanding of human nature, and her subtle ways of protecting me without exposing me to unnecessary conflict. She had known exactly how my brother would behave, how my parents might interpret situations, and how easy it would be to assume that favoritism was straightforward. But she had layered complexity into her instructions, ensuring that only careful observation and patience would uncover the truth. It felt surreal to think that for years my visibility, or lack thereof, had been a silent test. I had been marked by my brother's assumptions, by the family's applause for his loyalty, by their subtle nods that confirmed my invisibility. And yet, here I was, holding the map to clarity. I wasn't just the one overlooked anymore. I was the one entrusted with understanding, the one capable of seeing the full picture. The inheritance was no longer about money. It was about revelation, about unmasking the assumptions that had constrained me. I revisited the second letter, reading my grandmother's precise words. I needed to see who you became when you thought you had nothing. That sentence alone reframed everything. It wasn't a gift, it was a challenge. A test of character. The letter anticipated every argument, every claim of favoritism, every whispered assumption. She had left me the account, the ledger, and the deeds not just as financial instruments but as instruments of insight, a way to expose the truth about those who believed they were in control. The more I considered it, the more I understood how carefully she had structured the plan. The funeral had been designed to cement a narrative, one my brother had relied on completely. He had been confident, smug, certain of his place. He had leaned in and whispered, believing that he had the moral high ground, that his sacrifices and attention entitled him to everything. But the ledger told a different story. It documented the reality. He had visited sporadically, contributed minimally, and attempted to assert influence in ways my grandmother explicitly blocked. She had been protecting, teaching, and testing all at once. I could feel the shift in myself as I absorbed it. There was no need for confrontation, no need to shout or prove anything. The letters and the ledger did the work of revelation. I had the facts, the evidence, and the clarity to move forward on my terms. That was power in its quietest, most effective form. The ability to act without drama, to hold authority without spectacle. I could decide when, how, and to what extent the truth would be shared. I wasn't motivated by humiliation or revenge. I was motivated by understanding and control. I spent hours reconstructing the timeline, mapping out each interaction over the past year. I traced every question my brother had asked, every subtle attempt to position himself, every assumption my parents had made about me being sidelined. The second letter had created a narrative framework, a lens through which I could finally see how the family dynamics had been manipulated and misinterpreted. It wasn't just about favoritism, It was about control, perception, and the ability to maintain influence under the guise of morality and loyalty. Then came the moment of internal reckoning. I realized that my grandmother's gift wasn't just the account or the ledger. It was trust. She had trusted me to act with discernment, to interpret her instructions without coercion, and to understand that true influence comes from knowledge, patience, and integrity, not spectacle. And that realization settled something deep inside me. For years, I had sought validation, recognition, and fairness. Now, I understood that the validation I needed had already been silently granted. I simply had to acknowledge it and act. I made my decision carefully. I would not confront my brother publicly. I would not seek to shame anyone. Instead, I would ensure that the truth was documented, recognized by institutions where it mattered, and kept safe from manipulation. The hidden account, the deeds, the ledger, they were all outside of probate, outside of anyone else's reach. The letters were my instructions, my confirmation that my grandmother had intended for me to navigate this without fanfare, without conflict, and with clarity. Sitting there, I allowed myself to breathe. The quiet control I had gained felt like a release. The funeral had been a performance, my brother's smugness a mask, my parents' subtle nods a reinforcement of false perception. But the second letter had rewritten everything. The power dynamics had shifted, and for the first time I felt the freedom that comes from understanding and strategy. I was no longer invisible. I was not just a participant in the story. I was a custodian of the truth, capable of navigating the complex landscape of family, expectation, and perception. And so, I placed the letters and ledger carefully back into their protective envelope, the account information secure, the deeds annotated and verified. I didn't need to rush, I didn't need to announce. My grandmother's plan had already ensured that the narrative would unfold as it needed to, at the right time and in the right way. All I needed to do was follow the path she had mapped out and trust in the structure she had created. As I stepped outside, the sun broke through the clouds. The rain-soaked streets glistened, reflecting the world anew. And in that moment I realized something profound. The inheritance wasn't about money. It had never been about wealth. It was about clarity, strategy, foresight, and the ability to act wisely when others believed they held all the power. My grandmother had given me the ultimate gift. The understanding of who I was, the knowledge of what I could do, and the freedom to choose my path with confidence. And with that clarity I finally smiled, not because I had won but because I had seen. I had understood. And I had the power to move forward on my own terms,